Welcome, my friend, and thank you for choosing to spend your evening here with me. Before we begin, I invite you to settle into a comfortable position, soften your breathing just a little, and allow the world around you to quiet down. Tonight's story is one you are not meant to rush through. It is a slow journey through time, whispered through gentle shadows and soft echoes, a story meant to help your mind wander, loosen, and drift. In this video, we will walk together through the 20 dark events surrounding America's most controversial mansion, a place shaped by dreams, storms, secrets, misunderstandings, and power. Across a full century, this mansion witnessed everything from glittering celebrations to lonely abandonment, from whispered conversations to national debates, from careful restorations to legal storms. Every chapter holds its own quiet tension, its own soft sadness, its own unanswered questions. And tonight, you will hear them not as loud headlines, but as calming, slow-moving stories shaped to help you fall asleep gently, as if history itself were tucking you into a warm blanket of memory. As we move through each part, you'll hear about the mansion's earliest beginnings, when one woman's dream carved itself into stone, about the workers who built it under the weight of heat and hope, about the long silent years after its owner passed away, and the uncertain moment when the estate was almost lost forever. You'll hear how it was revived, how it became a centre of influence, how misunderstandings formed around it like fog, and how its image grew larger than the building itself. And finally, you'll hear how the mansion learned to live with its own legacy, complicated, beautiful, and quietly resilient. My aim is not to overwhelm you with facts, but to guide you gently through a century-long story in a calm rhythm, with soft images, smooth transitions, and a voice crafted to help your mind rest while your imagination drifts. This is history told for sleep, unhurried and warm, a soft journey through time where every detail is a stepping stone into deeper relaxation. Before we begin, I'd love to know something about you. Where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it where you are right now? People from all around the world gather here each evening, forming a quiet, peaceful circle of listeners, each in their own room, each with their own thoughts, yet sharing the same story under different skies. If this style of storytelling helps you unwind, if it brings you calm, comfort, or even just a gentle distraction from a long day, I invite you to support the channel in the simplest way by liking the video and subscribing to The Entire History. Your support helps these slow, soothing stories continue, and it tells YouTube that this is a peaceful corner worth sharing with others who might need rest just as much as you do. So, take one more slow breath, let the weight of the day fall a little further from your shoulders, and allow your mind to soften. Tonight, we will step quietly into a mansion built almost a century ago, a place of dreams, shadows, ambitions, and whispered memories. And we will follow its story from the first spark of imagination to the last gentle echo of legacy. Whenever you're ready, let's begin our journey together. Tonight, you are listening to part 1, and this part is about the very first dark seed that was planted long before the mansion became famous, the moment when one woman's shining dream quietly wrapped itself around a quieter fear that she would one day be forgotten. In the early 1920s, when Florida was still being sold to the rest of America as a warm frontier of sunshine and opportunity, Marjorie Merriweather Post stood on a stretch of rough ground between the ocean and the inland waters and tried to imagine something that did not exist yet. She had more money than most people could ever dream of, her name already printed in newspapers and on company papers, but inside her chest there was a restless ache that wealth could not soothe. She wanted to leave behind not just numbers on a page or a business empire run by others. She wanted to build a place that would outlast voices, fashions, even her own body, a place so grand that future generations would whisper her name when they walked across its floors. That wish, glowing softly at the centre of her thoughts, was the start of everything that would follow, both the beauty and the darkness, both the pride and the strain. Yet even as she pictured arches, courtyards, towers and music rooms, another quieter voice inside her asked whether any of it would truly matter once she was gone. She'd seen fortunes fade and houses sold. Family names that once commanded attention slowly slip from conversation. The idea that this could also be her fate frightened her more than she ever admitted out loud. That fear became the shadow behind her dream. If she built something big enough, maybe time would not erase her. So she walked the uneven ground, feeling sand sink under her shoes, smelling the mix of salt and soil, and told herself that here, on this land, where the wind met the water, she would anchor her memory to stone. From the very beginning there were struggles that did not appear in elegant photographs. Inside herself, she wrestled with doubts about the scale of what she planned. Was it arrogance to build a palace for herself, a private world of gold and imported tile, when so many strangers elsewhere lived in cramped rooms and worried about their next meal? Some nights she lay awake, listening to the distant sound of waves and the closer rustle of palms, wondering if this dream was really a way to serve art and culture, or simply a very expensive shield against the fear of loneliness and the passing of time. During the day, she pushed those questions aside, filling her hours with architects' sketches and samples of materials. At night, when the house that did not yet exist kept visiting her imagination, the questions returned, pressing softly but firmly against her. Outside, the world also pushed back. Building something vast on that exposed stretch of land was no small task. Engineers worried about storms and wind. Costs rose higher than first estimates. Labour shortages, shipping delays, and the constant challenge of bringing fragile decorative pieces from distant places made the project feel, at times, like trying to assemble a fragile sculpture in the middle of a moving river. Some local voices muttered that the whole idea was too large, too proud, a kind of fantasy better suited to old Europe than to an American coastline still finding its shape. Yet Marjorie was not alone. Around her, a circle of people formed who were drawn to the scale of her plan. Architects with careful eyes studied Spanish and Mediterranean designs and translated them into drawings that could rise on Florida soil. Craftsmen who had spent their lives working with stone, wood, and plaster found a strange joy in being asked to create something that would demand their full skill. Gardeners imagined how paths, trees, and fountains could soften the hard lines of walls and roofs. Secretaries and assistants, often invisible in official stories, organized meetings, letters, and numbers so that the dream did not dissolve into confusion. Together, this network of hands and minds carried her vision forward, even on days when her own confidence trembled. The turning point of this first event came slowly, not as a single dramatic moment, but as a season when the land itself began to change shape. Piles of materials grew, foundations were poured, walls rose where there had previously been only air. Standing on an upper level of unfinished stone one afternoon, Marjorie looked out and saw not just frames and scaffolds, but the outline of the world she had imagined. Long galleries open to the breeze, a great hall where guests would one day gather, windows that would catch the first light of morning and the last colour of evening. For a brief time, the fear that had chased her seemed to step back. Here was proof that her will, her wealth, and her determination could carve something lasting into the shore. And yet, even in that moment of quiet triumph, a small unease remained in the background of her thoughts. She understood, somewhere deep inside, that a house this large would always demand to be fed, with money, with staff, with attention. It would not simply stand as a monument, it would become a living responsibility. When the first sections neared completion, the results were breathtaking to those who saw them. Carved doors from distant countries, painted ceilings, carefully laid tiles, and intricate ironwork combined to create spaces that felt older than they really were, as if a fragment of another continent had been lifted and set down beside the American water. Visitors praised her taste, her courage, her generosity in creating a place that could host music, art, and social life on such a scale. But under the compliments lay quieter questions about what it meant to tie so much of herself to stone. The mansion that would later be praised, attacked, defended and debated had been born from a deeply human mix of longing and fear, generosity and pride. As the final workers of that first phase put away their tools for the evening and the new walls rested in the fading light, the whole estate seemed to pause for a breath, like a great instrument tuned but not yet played, waiting for the first notes of the long, complicated song that would be performed inside it for the next 100 years. Tonight, you are listening to part 2, and this part is about the second dark event in the mansion's long history, the grueling, chaotic, and often hidden struggles during the construction years, when the dream of Mar-a-Lago demanded a price far greater than anyone expected, drawing out exhaustion, conflict, accidents, and the quiet suffering of the workers who built it. In the beginning, when the first plans were laid out on long tables and the land was marked with stakes and strings, the ambition still looked bright, as if the building would rise from the ground through pure imagination alone. But very quickly, as workers arrived with tools slung over their shoulders and wagons carried heavy loads across the sand, the estate revealed its deeper truth. This was no ordinary build, and beneath the surface of progress lay a spreading sense of strain. The people who came to work here carried their own hopes. Many wanted steady pay, a chance to support families, a sense of purpose in shaping something grand. They imagined telling stories years later about how they helped build one of the most remarkable structures in the region. Their cut cow, the quiet dream in their hearts, was simple: to build something lasting and be proud of it. But as the days stretched into weeks, and the weeks into sweltering months under the Florida sun, the internal struggles began to appear. Heat pressed down like a heavy hand. Muscles ached, tempers frayed. Some workers doubted whether the project made sense at all. Others questioned the endless demands for perfection, tiles to be relaid because the angle felt slightly off, arches to be reshaped, colours to be adjusted, carvings to be redone. Many nights men left the site with their shirts soaked and their spirits thin, wondering whether the dream they were serving belonged to anyone but the wealthy, and deeper still was a quiet fear. No matter how hard they worked, none of their names would ever be remembered. Outside the construction site, opposing forces added to the burden. Shipments from distant places arrived damaged or late. Storms swept across the coastline unexpectedly, undoing days of progress in a single afternoon. Local officials questioned the scale of the mansion, neighbours whispered doubts, and newspapers occasionally mocked the idea of building such an extravagant palace on such unpredictable ground. Every setback carved another line of worry across the workers' faces, and every delay pulled the dream further from reach. Yet in the midst of this pressure, a group of unexpected allies emerged. Master craftsmen stepped forward, men who understood stone, metal, and wood with a kind of quiet wisdom. They steadied the younger workers, teaching them how to shape difficult materials, how to breathe through the heat, how to see the larger picture when small frustrations threatened to overwhelm them. Foremen organised teams into smoother rhythms, ensuring no one collapsed from exhaustion. Supply managers searched tirelessly for alternative sources when shipments failed. Even Marjorie herself provided encouragement in small gestures, a brief visit to the site, a calm word of thanks, or moments when she walked among the workers and asked about their progress with genuine attention. Though she could not lift stones or carve beams, her presence reminded them that the dream was not empty. It had a heart beating at its centre. Then came the climax of this second event, a moment whispered about years later by those who had been there. One afternoon, after weeks of tension and labour, a major support beam cracked unexpectedly as it was being lifted into place. The sound echoed across the site like a warning. Workers scrambled back. Dust rose. Tools clattered to the ground. For several minutes, no one moved. The crack had not caused injury, but the message was undeniable. The house they were building demanded more than skill. It demanded caution, respect, and unity. That evening, as the sun fell and long shadows stretched across the half-built structure, a quiet meeting formed among the workers. They spoke softly about the danger, the exhaustion, the weight of the project. Yet, instead of giving up, something in them settled, like steel hardening in fire. They decided to stay, to keep building, to finish what they had begun, not only because they needed the work, but because they understood they were part of something larger than themselves. The turning point had not been the crack in the beam, but the realization that the mansion was changing them, even as they shaped it. In the following days, the atmosphere shifted. Workers adjusted their methods, communicated more clearly, watched each other's steps more carefully. Foremen enforced safer routines. Craftsmen slowed down to ensure quality over speed. The mansion rose, arched, carved, layered, and detailed through sweat, caution, and collaboration. Bit by bit, the walls became sturdy, the floors levelled, the towers climbed skyward. And when the final stages of that construction phase arrived, the outcome felt different from what anyone had expected. Yes, the building was beautiful, grand, intricate, shimmering with imported materials and handcrafted details. But beneath the beauty lay something far more powerful. The hidden history of those who had built it, their struggles, fears, mistakes, and quiet triumphs. As this second event closes, the mansion stands in its early form, not yet complete, but already carrying the weight of human labour carved into every surface. And late at night, when the workers have gone home and tools rest in silence, the half-built structure seems to hum with the memory of hands that shaped it, hands that trembled, bled, steadied, and persevered. A faint glimmer from a distant lantern catches on a rough patch of stone still waiting to be smoothed, like a soft reminder that even the strongest foundations begin with moments of fragile effort. Tonight you are listening to part 3, and this part is about the first golden evenings inside the finished mansion, when the lights, the laughter, and the music tried to hide a darker feeling growing underneath. The sense that this glittering place was becoming a stage where people came less to enjoy beauty and more to measure power and status against one another. When the main halls of the mansion were finally complete, Marjorie felt a rush of relief and pride. The long rooms were filled with rich colours and detailed patterns. Chandeliers hung above like frozen bursts of light. Tables could be arranged for large dinners. Balconies opened toward the water, and smaller rooms waited to be filled with private conversations. Her deepest wish at that time was simple. She wanted these spaces to come alive. She wanted intelligent people, artists, diplomats, and leaders of business to talk under these ceilings, to share ideas, to feel that they were part of something graceful and meaningful. She imagined evenings where music flowed gently in the background, where guests felt uplifted, where the mansion became not just a private palace, but a kind of cultural heart beating quietly on the coast. But even as she planned those gatherings, an inner unease began to form. She worried that the charm of such evenings might fade quickly, that what started as a celebration of art and friendship could slide into something shallow. In quieter moments, she asked herself whether people would come because they cared about conversation or because they wanted to be seen in a place that others would envy. She wondered if her own desire to create something enduring had slipped into a need to prove her importance. These thoughts made her restless. To calm them, she focused on the details of each event, the menu, the placement of chairs, the choice of music. Yet the questions remained, hidden like thin cracks beneath fresh paint. Outside the mansion, forces beyond her control shaped the tone of those early parties. Newspapers liked to mention her name alongside words like richest, grandest, and most luxurious. Society pages described the estate in glowing terms, calling it a palace, a dream, a wonder. These words drew more guests, but they also brought new expectations. People arrived already imagining what the night should mean for their own reputations. Some wanted to be photographed in the right corners of the right rooms. Others hoped to be invited back simply so they could say they belonged to the inner circle. The house, which had been built from a personal longing, was quickly becoming a symbol others used for their own quiet competitions. Still, Marjorie was not alone in trying to keep the evenings from slipping fully into vanity. Loyal staff members understood her original vision and tried to support it. A head butler, with steady hands, trained his team to move gracefully, so that service would feel invisible and guests could focus on each other instead of logistics. A musician she trusted chose pieces that matched the mood she wanted. Gentle, thoughtful, not too loud or showy. A close friend sometimes stood beside her during receptions, guiding certain guests toward meaningful conversations rather than empty bragging. These allies could not change human nature, but they helped shape the evenings so that, at least some of the time, beneath the glitter, real connection could still flicker. One night, however, brought the quiet climax of this third event. It was a large gathering with important visitors from far away. The rooms were full. Discussions shifted from light topics to business and power. At one point, standing near an archway, Marjorie overheard a small group speaking not about the art on the walls or the music in the air, but about how being seen in her mansion could help them in their private agendas. They spoke of alliances, influence, and advantages, all in low practical voices, as if the mansion were nothing more than a clever tool, a shiny knife in a velvet case. For a short moment she felt as if the floor beneath her had tilted. The house she had created to give beauty and meaning to her life was being used as a backdrop for games she did not fully control. Later that evening, after the last guests had drifted toward their cars and the laughter had grown thinner, she walked alone through the main hall. The staff had begun to clear glasses and fold linens. A few small marks on the floor showed where chairs had scraped. Here and there, a napkin remained on a table's edge. The air still held traces of perfume and food, but the life of the party had already drained away, leaving only surfaces behind. In that moment, she felt tired in a deep, quiet way. Yes, the evening had been called a success. Yes, important people had come. Yes, the building had once again proven its power to impress. And yet, she could not shake the feeling that something essential had been lost, or at least pushed to the edges. The house was full of sound, and yet strangely empty at the same time. In the days that followed, she tried to adjust. She chose guests more carefully when she could, invited people she thought would appreciate the art, the gardens, the thought behind each room. She arranged smaller gatherings, hoping for deeper conversations. But the reputation of the mansion had already begun to grow beyond her reach. People now saw it as a place where being invited meant something about who they were in the world. The estate had become a mirror in which guests tried to see their own significance reflected back at them. The result of this third event was a subtle but lasting shift. The mansion was no longer just a dream brought into stone. It was now a social engine, drawing in people with their own ambitions, fears, and quiet selfishness. It still held beauty, kindness, and rare moments of sincere connection, but these shared the space with rivalry, hidden agendas, and the pressure to appear important. This mixture would only grow stronger over the years. As this part of the story closes, the mansion rests after another grand evening. Tables are bare, floors are swept, lights are lowered. In one of the great rooms, a single chair remains slightly turned away from the others, as if someone had once sat there, thinking of leaving early, but stayed out of politeness. No one notices it as the staff finishes their work. Yet that chair, slightly out of place, seems to hold the quiet shape of doubt lingering in the air. A small crooked line inside a very careful drawing, hinting that beneath the polished surface of this new social world, something more complicated has begun to grow. Tonight, you are listening to Hassett and Part Out and 4, and this part is about the moment when the mansion's carefully built world of elegance collided with a colder truth. The government, far from embracing Marjorie's dream, quietly rejected the idea of turning the estate into a national treasure, leaving the mansion suspended between glory and abandonment, and leaving her with the heavy realization that even the grandest creations cannot force themselves into history unless history chooses to hold them. When the early shine of her great parties began to settle and the years moved forward, Marjorie's deepest wish turned toward permanence. She wanted the mansion to outlive her, not as a private home alone, but as a place that belonged to the country, a cultural landmark, a winter presidential retreat, a gift from her to the nation. She imagined leaders walking through the long corridors, diplomats gathering in the great hall, orchestras playing beneath the carved ceilings. In her mind, the mansion would become a symbol of beauty, generosity, and continuity, a place where America could show its refined side to the world. It was a noble dream, born not from selfishness, but from a woman who genuinely believed that what she had built could serve a greater purpose. Yet inside herself there was an uneasy flicker. She feared the mansion might someday be misunderstood or neglected. She feared its scale would become a burden. She feared that once she was gone, those who inherited the place would not love it as she did. These thoughts kept her awake during quiet nights, walking through dim halls with only her footsteps for company, asking herself whether giving the estate to the nation was the only way to protect it from fading into private irrelevance. But outside those halls, forces beyond her imagination began to gather, forces that did not share her vision. When she formally offered the estate to the US government, hoping it would be accepted as a winter White House, the response she received was not admiration but hesitation. Officials examined the offer with cool, practical eyes. They saw a massive building, expensive to maintain, demanding in both staff and upkeep, positioned on a coastline, vulnerable to storms. They saw cost, complication, responsibility, not beauty, not history being born. Behind their polite language, the message was clear: they did not want it. That rejection struck harder than any personal criticism she had ever received. Inside her heart, the quiet internal conflict she had carried for years suddenly sharpened into something darker. Had she built too much? Had her dream become too heavy, even for a nation to hold? Was the mansion not a gift, but a burden disguised in stone and gold? She had believed that good intentions and great architecture could carve her name into history. But now, faced with the cold refusal of the government, she felt the first crack of doubt split through her confidence. Outside, pressures grew harsher. Newspapers hinted that the estate was excessive. Some commentators whispered that it was impractical, too large, too costly, too extravagant for a country with shifting priorities. Others claimed the location was unsafe for important officials, too exposed, too unpredictable. Even among her social circle, people politely questioned whether the estate truly had national importance, or whether it was simply too tied to her personal identity. These external doubts pressed at her like a slowly tightening ring, forcing her to confront the possibility that she had misread what the world valued. Yet in this darker moment, allies emerged in quiet ways. A few close friends reassured her that the rejection was not personal. Some staff members, seeing her disappointment, continued caring for the mansion with even greater devotion, tending gardens, polishing railings, and keeping the house alive as though trying to prove its worth through their hands. Her daughter listened to her fears without judgment. A historian wrote her a thoughtful letter praising the estate's cultural value, reminding her that greatness was not measured only by official approval. And these small voices of support became the hands that steadied her when the dreams she had built began to grow unsteady. The climax of this fourth event came during a late afternoon when she walked alone through the empty rooms that she had once imagined filled with diplomats and presidents. Sunlight drifted across mosaics she had chosen herself. The air held only the soft hum of silence. As she paused in the great hall, she felt the full weight of what the rejection meant. The nation she had hoped to gift her masterpiece to did not want it. The house stood beautiful, complete, and impressive, but unwanted by the very institution she believed it could serve. She stood quietly, absorbing this truth, and for the first time since the mansion's early construction, she felt small inside her own creation. That day marked a turning point. Her hope of securing the mansion's future through national recognition faded. The estate's fate now rested not in the hands of the country, but in private ownership once she was gone. And with that realization came a subtle shift inside the house itself. It no longer felt like a rising monument reaching for a grand destiny. It felt like a giant structure quietly holding its breath, uncertain what would happen to it after its creator could no longer protect it. In the years that followed, the outcome of this rejection shaped the mansion's path. Marjorie continued hosting events, but something in her softened. She no longer spoke as passionately about the future of the estate. She focused instead on maintaining it as best she could, keeping its beauty alive, even as she slowly accepted that it might not become what she once dreamed. Visitors still admired its grandeur, still praised her taste, still marveled at its scale. But beneath all the light and praise, the darker truth remained. The house had been built for a future that did not arrive. And so, as Part 4 closes, the mansion rests under the fading light of another long day. The rooms are tidy, the gardens freshly trimmed, the great hall quiet. A single window near the southern wing reflects the last red glow of the sky, not as a symbol of triumph, but as a gentle reminder that even the brightest dreams can cast long shadows when the world does not see them the way their creator hoped. Tonight, you are listening to Part 5, and this part is about the dark stretch of time that followed Marjorie's death, the years when the great mansion, once full of orchestras and conversations and carefully curated beauty, slipped into a long period of neglect, uncertainty, and near abandonment. It was a time when the house began to feel the weight of being ownerless, purposeless, and slowly forgotten, standing quietly against the shore while the world moved on without it. After Marjorie passed, the mansion's deepest wish was simple and almost childlike. It wanted someone to care for it again. It wanted footsteps in its halls, lights in its windows, voices echoing through its grand rooms. It wanted to feel necessary, to feel loved, to feel that it still mattered. But inside its own walls, a heavy loneliness began to form. The estate felt silence first. Rooms that once glowed with warm lamps now stayed dim for days at a time. Doors that once swung open and closed, with confident rhythm began to stiffen from disuse. The kitchen, once buzzing with staff preparing elaborate meals, sat cold and dusted. Even the gardens, so carefully shaped during Marjorie's lifetime, slowly lost their edges as weeds crept in. The mansion had always been large, but now the emptiness made it feel endless. And in this silence, a deeper internal conflict stirred. What if the government's rejection had not been a misunderstanding, but a sign? What if the house truly had no future? Outside, opposing forces tightened around the estate like slow-moving vines. Maintaining such a massive property required money. Money the heirs could not or would not invest at the level needed. Taxes grew, storms hit the coastline, adding new cracks, leaks, and damage. The community whispered about the impractical size of the home. Some believed it should be sold. Others suggested it should be demolished. A few saw it as a strange relic of a bygone age. Real estate developers eyed the land with cold interest. The mansion, once admired for its grandeur, was now spoken of as a burden, a problem, an expensive leftover from an era that no longer existed. Yet, even in this dark stretch, the estate found unexpected allies, quiet ones, almost invisible to the world. A small group of caretakers, assigned to maintain the property, worked far beyond their wages. Gardeners tended dying plants, not because they were instructed to, but because they remembered how beautiful the grounds once were. A maintenance worker patched leaks, cleaned gutters, and oiled hinges, even when no one was watching. A housekeeper continued dusting parts of the home simply because she couldn't bear to see the beauty fade faster than it already was. Their devotion was quiet, steady, and often unnoticed, but it kept the mansion alive when neglect could have easily swallowed it whole. The climax of this fifth event came one late afternoon during a storm that swept across the coast. Heavy rain pounded the roof. Wind pushed against the tall windows, rattling them in their frames. For a few moments the mansion seemed to sway under the pressure of the weather. Water began leaking through several points in the upper floors, dripping down interior walls like thin fingers tracing old sorrow. One caretaker climbed into the rafters during the height of the storm, patching what he could with limited tools, working in almost complete darkness. When the storm ended and sunlight finally broke through the clouds, the house stood battered but still standing. And in that tired quiet, the caretaker sat alone in the great hall, soaking wet, staring at the damage he had barely prevented. Something in the mansion shifted then, not physically, but emotionally. It realized that despite everything, despite the neglect, despite the rejection, despite being forgotten by the institutions that once admired it, there were still a few people willing to fight for it. A few people who believed it deserved to survive. That moment became the turning point. Over the following months and years, the estate did not thrive, but it endured. The gardens did not return to their former glory, but they stopped declining. The rooms were not lively again, but they were kept from collapse. The roof was not fully repaired, but it was patched enough to endure the rains. Visitors were rare, but those who came whispered with a kind of awe, moved by the mixture of beauty and sorrow. The outcome of this period was a strange, fragile stability. The mansion remained empty in spirit, but alive in body, like an elderly being kept alive by the careful hands of a few who remembered its younger years. The estate survived long enough to reach a future it could not yet imagine. And so, as part 5 comes to its soft close, the mansion sits quietly in the fading light. Dust floats lazily through high ceilings. A cracked window in an upstairs hallway lets in a thin line of air. On a forgotten table sits an old silver tray, slightly tarnished, but still catching a faint glimmer of evening brightness, like a reminder that even during years of neglect, a trace of the mansion's original dignity refused to disappear. Tonight you are listening to Part 6, and this part is about the turning point when the long quiet mansion finally changed hands, the controversial sale that would reshape its destiny forever. It was the moment when a place built from one woman's dream and nearly abandoned after her death was suddenly pulled back into the spotlight, bought by a new owner whose ambition, confidence and boldness stirred both admiration and suspicion. This was the beginning of the mansion's second life, and the beginning of its modern shadows. After years of drifting without purpose, the mansion's deepest wish had grown simple. It wanted to be chosen. It wanted someone to see value in it again, someone who would walk through its halls not with the eyes of a tired caretaker, but with the imagination of a new visionary. The house longed for footsteps, light and direction. It wished for a future that wasn't defined by neglect or indecision. In its stillness, the estate felt like a grand instrument waiting for someone to play the next movement. But beneath this wish, an internal struggle brewed. The mansion knew it had become too large, too costly, too demanding for most people. It feared being carved apart, the gardens sold to developers, the rooms stripped for profit. It feared demolition. Worst of all, it feared being forgotten as a curiosity from a different era. These were anxieties woven deep into the walls after years of abandonment, like a quiet tremor under the surface. Outside its gates, the opposing forces gathered. Developers wanted the land. Real estate speculators argued the property was impractical. Some community members believed the estate should be broken into smaller parcels. Others thought the mansion had lost all cultural relevance. The government still had no interest in it, and financial pressures tightened like a belt around its foundation. Newspapers hinted that selling the property might be the only solution, even if the sale meant losing its original artistry forever. Then came the new owner. He did not see the mansion as a burden. He saw grandeur, possibility, and legacy. Where others saw peeling paint and costly repairs, he saw a jewel that simply needed polishing. Where others saw outdated rooms, he saw opportunity. To him, the estate was not a fading relic. It was a stage for reinvention. His confidence impressed some and unsettled others. But one truth became clear. The mansion had finally found someone bold enough to claim it. A small circle of allies formed around the new vision. Architects suggested fresh adaptations. Lawyers negotiated agreements. Some preservationists, surprisingly, supported the idea of restoring the mansion rather than letting it deteriorate further. Staff who had spent years maintaining the estate in silence felt hope bloom again. Gardens were trimmed, broken fixtures replaced, and long closed rooms reopened to air and light. The house, after years of quiet suffering, began to feel alive. The climax of this sixth event came during the negotiations and the final controversial sale. The low sale price shocked many. Some said it was too low for such a historic property. Others argued that the cost of renovations justified it. Critics accused the buyer of taking advantage of the estate's weakened state. Supporters said he had saved it from oblivion. Across newspapers and conversations, a new narrative began forming, one that cast the mansion into the centre of debate once again. And for the first time in years, people talked passionately about its future rather than quietly about its decay. When the sale was complete and the new owner walked through the entrance as its master, the mansion felt something it hadn't felt in decades: certainty. Whatever came next, Good or bad, its fate was no longer drifting. It had a direction, a heartbeat, a person willing to shoulder its enormous weight. The turning point was not simply that it had been bought, it was that someone believed it still had a purpose worth fighting for. The aftermath unfolded quickly. Renovations began, rooms were restored, plans were drawn, new events were prepared. For some, this new era symbolised revival. For others, it symbolised risk. But for the mansion itself, the outcome was clear. It was no longer disappearing. It was no longer forgotten. Its story, once fading under dust and neglect, had sparked back to life. And so, as Part 6 comes to a soft close, the mansion stands in a strange new glow. Workers carry tools through echoing halls. Fresh paint brightens once dim corners. Windows, opened after years of being shut tight, let in air that smells faintly of salt and new beginnings. And on a table near the entrance, a stack of blueprints rests beneath a paperweight, not yet unfolded, not yet understood, but waiting like a promise that the next chapter of the mansion's life is about to begin. Tonight you are listening to Part 7. And this part is about the conflict that erupted between the newly revived mansion and the community that surrounded it. The years when the estate's transformation into a private club stirred tension, legal battles, neighbourhood complaints, and quiet anxiety inside the mansion itself. It was a period when the house, reborn with new purpose, discovered that revival always invites resistance, and that every decision to expand its life creates shadows of opposition. When the renovations were underway and plans for a private club took shape, the mansion's deepest wish was hopeful. It wanted to be filled with people again. It wanted conversations, music, dinners, and footsteps echoing through its corridors. After decades of neglect, it longed to come alive, not just on special evenings, but every week, with new faces, new laughter, and new energy flowing through its rooms. It imagined itself as a vibrant social world, no longer sinking slowly into silence. But inside its grand structure, a quieter worry lingered. The mansion knew, in its own wordless way, that it had not been designed for constant crowds. Its walls, its gardens, its narrow service corridors, its fragile historical details carried memories of more controlled gatherings. The idea of transforming into a bustling club created a soft fear. Would constant activity wear it down? Would maintaining its beauty become an impossible task? Would the new life it wished for end up overwhelming it? Outside its gates, the opposing forces gathered quickly. Neighbours, who had grown used to quiet streets, now worried about noise, traffic, parking, deliveries, and crowds. Some feared losing the calm of their coastal community. Others doubted the intentions of the new owner, suspecting profit, influence, or private ambition, hidden behind elegant announcements. Local officials questioned zoning rules, safety regulations, and environmental impact. Lawsuits began forming like distant clouds, slow but heavy. Complaints rose. Too many cars, too many guests, late-night activity, bright exterior lights, music drifting beyond the walls. The mansion, which had once stood silent and ignored, now found itself watched closely. Every change, every sound, every event recorded and debated. What had been a dream of revival had become a battlefield of opinions. Yet in this tense time, allies stepped forward. Some locals appreciated the effort to preserve historic architecture rather than see the mansion demolished. Long-time residents remembered the estate from decades earlier and felt relief that it was no longer decaying. Preservationists argued that keeping the mansion active was the only way to save it. Club members praised the renovations, the renewed gardens, the restored rooms. Staff, who had worked through years of neglect, felt proud to see life return to the house. They spoke kindly about the changes, defending the vision and encouraging patience. These small voices became the unseen hands supporting the estate as pressure tightened around it. The climax of this seventh event unfolded during a heated public hearing about the club's operations. Local residents spoke passionately, expressing fears about noise traffic and the mansion's growing influence. Legal representatives argued over zoning definitions and long-standing restrictions. Supporters emphasized preservation, history, and economic benefit. Opponents emphasized peace, privacy, and the right to their quiet lives. The debate stretched into long hours, with intensity building like a storm just offshore. During that hearing, a different kind of tension drifted through the mansion itself. Though the estate could not hear the arguments, it felt the weight of uncertainty, a heavy, quiet pressure in its halls, as if waiting for a verdict that would decide whether it could continue living or be pushed back into the shadows it had only recently escaped. When the decision finally arrived, allowing the mansion to operate as a private club under certain limitations, it marked the turning point. It was not a perfect victory. Some restrictions remained. Some neighbours stayed resentful. Some disputes continued. But the estate had survived the challenge. It would not fade again. It would not sit empty. It would live, even if that life came with conflict. The aftermath was a mix of relief and responsibility. Staff adjusted routines to meet new rules. Events were planned more carefully. Sound levels were managed with precision. Gardens were shaped to act as sound buffers. Security was refined. The mansion learned to balance its renewed social energy with the need to coexist with the community beyond its gates. And in this careful balance, the estate found a new kind of maturity. It accepted that a second life would not be peaceful. Revival comes with friction. Ambition comes with resistance. A house that rises again must face the voices that tried to keep it quiet. And so, as Part 7 closes, the mansion stands in the stillness of late night after another long day of preparation and negotiation. A few tables remain set for an event tomorrow, polished glass catching faint reflections from overhead lights. Outside, near the boundary, where the estate meets the neighbourhood, a single garden lamp glows softly against trimmed hedges. Its light falls on a narrow path worn by years of footsteps, a quiet reminder that every revival, no matter how bright, is shaped by the shadows it must walk through. Tonight you are listening to on Part 8, and this part is about the era of lavish gatherings, the nights when the mansion, now reborn as a private club, hosted events filled with glittering lights and powerful guests. But beneath the polished surfaces and elegant details, these celebrations carried a darker truth. Deals whispered in corners, alliances formed behind smiles, and ambitions quietly shaping the mansion's modern reputation. This was the period when glamour and shadow intertwined so tightly that even the mansion itself could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. When the club first opened its doors to selected members, the mansion's deepest wish was excitement. After decades of silence and legal tension, it longed for warmth, movement, and laughter. It imagined evenings filled with voices drifting from room to room, music softly touching its walls, and footsteps breathing life back into its floors. It wanted to feel useful again, not as a museum piece or abandoned relic, but as a living stage for people who carried influence and stories of their own. But inside, a quiet conflict grew. The mansion sensed that these gatherings were not simply social. Guests arrived dressed beautifully, but their intentions were rarely as gentle as their appearance. Conversations sounded smooth, but carried undercurrents. Smiles were polite, but tense. Some guests admired the architecture. Others scanned the room calculatingly, as if measuring the value of every handshake. The estate began to feel that while its halls were once meant for art and joy, they were now being used for something sharper, the choreography of modern influence. Outside the mansion, opposing forces watched closely. Journalists speculated about who was invited. Locals whispered about the high-profile gatherings. Critics accused the estate of becoming a playground for the elite. Activists questioned the transparency of these meetings. Every event brought attention, some admiring, some suspicious. The mansion had wanted life, but it had not anticipated becoming a lighthouse visible from every direction, drawing both admiration and envy. Yet inside these glamorous nights, unexpected allies emerged. There were musicians who performed with sincerity, caring only to create beauty. There were long-time staff members who moved with kindness, ensuring guests felt welcomed rather than judged. And there were a few guests, rare but genuine, who came not to gain advantage, but simply to experience an extraordinary place filled with history. These people softened the edges of the mansion's anxiety. They reminded it that not every person entering its halls was driven by hidden motives. The climax of this 8th event came during a grand evening that the mansion would remember long after. Lights filled the gardens, tables were arranged with precision, conversations floated like warm currents. But in one secluded corner of the estate, a small group of powerful individuals gathered for a hushed discussion. Their quiet voices spoke of decisions that could shape businesses, policies, and people far beyond the mansion's walls. The estate felt a strange tremor, not physical but emotional, as it realized that its rooms had become part of a larger web of influence. It had wished for life, but had not expected to become a silent witness to choices that carried real consequences. When the night ended and the guests departed, the turning point settled into place. The mansion understood that its role had changed permanently. It was no longer merely hosting dinners. It was hosting intentions. Its walls were no longer passive. They now absorbed secrets, ambitions, and the soft friction of competing motives. Revival had come with a cost. The estate's innocence had slipped quietly into the shadows of power. The aftermath unfolded in subtle ways. Staff moved with increased awareness, sensing the weight of the conversations they overheard. Security protocols tightened, not for decoration, but necessity. Guests approached events with a sharper sense of purpose. Some came hoping to build connections, others came hoping to observe. A few came merely to appear, knowing that being seen in the right place at the right time mattered as much as anything they might say. But despite these layers of complexity, the mansion learned something important. It was still alive. It was needed. It was relevant. And even if the purity of its early vision had shifted, there was comfort in knowing that it had become a place where history continued to unfold, not quietly but boldly. And so, as Part 8 comes to a close, the mansion rests after another luminous evening. Empty glasses sit on polished tables. A faint hum from distant equipment still lingers in the air. Near a doorway leading to a private room once used for whispered discussions, a single candle, forgotten by the last guest, burns low, its light wavering gently against the wall, casting a soft, uneven glow. And in that small trembling flame, the estate feels the truth of its new life, beauty and shadow intertwined, shaping a story that is only beginning to deepen. Tonight you are listening to Part 9, and this part is about the long, grinding tension that grew around the mansion as loud complaints, legal threats, and community disputes began building into a shadowy storm, a time when the estate, after basking in the glow of glamorous nights, suddenly found itself questioned, challenged, and scrutinized. This was the era when conflict no longer came from silence or neglect, but from the uncomfortable friction between a reborn social powerhouse and the world forced to live in its orbit. When the first formal complaints arrived in letters and council meetings, the mansion's deepest wish was simply to keep the peace. After decades of abandonment and then revival, the estate wanted stability. It wanted the lights to stay on. the events to continue and the conversations to remain warm instead of heated. It wished that the community would see its beauty, its history, its vibrancy. More than anything, it hoped that coexistence was possible, that it could be both a private club and a good neighbour. But inside its walls, an internal struggle took shape. The mansion felt torn. On one side, it enjoyed the fullness of its new life. Events, music, prestigious visitors, activity, motion, purpose. On the other side, it sensed the mounting irritation from the surrounding community. Every raised voice at a hearing, every article criticising the club's practices, every frustrated resident complaining of traffic or lights seemed to echo faintly through its rooms, bouncing off ceilings once decorated for gentler occasions. The estate felt as though it had become too loud, too demanding, too heavy for those who lived nearby. It didn't know how to shrink itself to please others without losing what it had just regained. Outside its gates, opposing forces gathered with growing energy. Neighbours filed formal grievances about cars blocking narrow streets. Environmental groups questioned the impact of constant activity on the coastline. Local politicians began using the club's controversies as opportunities for visibility. Some residents feared their quiet mornings would be replaced forever by delivery trucks and the steady rumble of service vehicles. A few even framed the estate as a threat to the very character of the community. Everywhere, the mansion's name circulated, not as a place of culture or revival, but as a problem to be solved. And yet, not everyone stood against it. Allies emerged in measured voices. Local businesses appreciated the economic boost the club brought. Preservationists noted that without the private investment keeping the mansion alive, the estate might have been lost altogether. Some neighbours who enjoyed attending events quietly defended the mansion when conversations grew too heated. Within the estate itself, staff became mediators, adjusting event schedules, coordinating parking plans, refining lighting to reduce glare, and communicating with officials to find compromises. Their efforts did not erase conflict, but they softened the edges, proving that cooperation was still possible. The climax of this 9th event arrived when a particularly contentious dispute erupted over noise and nighttime activity. A formal hearing was held, and residents filled the room with a mixture of anger, fear, and frustration. They described sleepless nights, congested streets, and worries about the long-term impact on their neighbourhood. On the other side, representatives of the estate argued about tradition, restoration, and the importance of preserving a historic landmark through active use. The meeting stretched long into the evening. Voices rose, faces tightened, papers rustled like restless wings. At one point, a resident stood and declared that the mansion had grown too big for the town around it, claiming that its presence overshadowed their everyday lives. Those words stung. Even from afar, the estate felt the weight of them. It had dreamed of being admired, not resented. And in that moment, the house sensed that revival had come with a hidden price. After the hearing, a quiet turning point settled over the estate. It realised it could no longer rely on nostalgia, beauty, or historical significance alone. It had to adapt, or risk becoming a symbol of division rather than pride. In the months that followed, changes rippled across the property. Event sizes were reduced, soundproofing was improved, parking rules were tightened, lighting was adjusted, new agreements were drafted to address community concerns. Staff took these modifications seriously, knowing that each improvement was a step toward harmony. And slowly, the tension eased, not completely, but enough to breathe. The mansion learned something important in this period. Survival in the modern world required flexibility. It could remain elegant, grand, and alive, but it needed to soften its edges, temper its ambitions, and share space respectfully with those who lived around it. The outcome of this 9th event was not victory or defeat, but balance. The estate continued to thrive as a private club, but with a humbler rhythm. Neighbours still had concerns, but not with the same sharpness as before. The house regained a gentle confidence, understanding that even places built for grandeur must learn to bow, at least slightly, to the needs of the world outside their gates. And so, as Part 9 comes to a close, the mansion rests after another eventful day. Quiet settles slowly across the property. Tables have been cleared, lights dimmed, and the last vehicles have rolled away. Near the edge where the estate meets the neighbourhood, a narrow line of trimmed hedges stands carefully maintained, a living boundary between two worlds, learning, slowly and cautiously, to share the same night air. A single leaf trembles on the hedge, stirred by a soft passing draught, a reminder that even the smallest adjustments can shape peace in a place built from ambition. Tonight, you are listening to Part 10, and this part is about the slow but powerful shift inside the mansion when its modern identity began to crystallise, the moment when the estate realised it was no longer simply a private club or a restored relic, but a place that had drifted into the centre of national attention. This was the era when journalists, visitors, critics and supporters all began reshaping how the world saw the mansion, turning it step by step into a symbol far larger than its walls, and quietly planting the seeds for conflicts and shadows that would follow in the years ahead. When the attention first began growing, the mansion's deepest wish was clarity. It wanted to understand what it was becoming and why the world suddenly cared so much. It had spent decades longing not to be forgotten, then struggled through revival, conflict and negotiation. Now, as cameras and headlines pointed toward it, the estate wished only to know its new purpose. Was it a social hub? A historic treasure? A political landmark? A cultural symbol? The mansion felt stretched between identities like a tapestry pulled too tight. Inside this created a deep internal conflict. The estate remembered its origins, elegance, artistry, and the desire to inspire. But the voices echoing through its modern halls were no longer the same. Conversations became sharper, more strategic. Guests walked its corridors not for beauty alone, but for meaning and influence. The mansion sensed that the energy filling it was changing, and although it tried to adapt, a quiet anxiety settled in its foundations, the fear that it was losing control of its own narrative. Outside the estate, powerful opposing forces gathered. Journalists wrote articles dissecting its events, its membership, its architecture, its symbolism. Critics argued about what the mansion represented. Supporters defended its legacy and celebrated its revival. Some people praised its grandeur, calling it a reflection of American ambition. Others described it as the embodiment of excess and controversy. Political commentators mentioned it frequently, sometimes admiringly, sometimes harshly. The house felt as if the entire country had turned its gaze toward it, a gaze heavy enough to bend its shadow. But amid this rising turbulence, the mansion found new allies who helped shape its emerging identity. Historians stepped forward to remind the public of its origins and architectural significance. Preservationists argued for protecting its cultural value. Artists photographed the estate with thoughtful intention, highlighting details easily overlooked: intricate ceilings, old ironwork, quiet courtyards. Long-time staff members, steady, calm, invisible to the media, maintained the house with devotion, giving it stability in the middle of growing external chaos. These voices offered a counterbalance to the louder narratives. They helped the estate understand that being seen by the world did not have to mean losing itself. The climax of this 10th event came during a period when news coverage surged dramatically. A single photograph circulated widely, showing a high-profile dinner held in one of the mansion's most recognisable rooms. The image travelled across televisions, newspapers, and online platforms. People debated, what it meant, who was present, what decisions might have been discussed, and whether the estate was appropriate for such gatherings. The mansion had been photographed many times before, but never with this intensity. It was not the architecture that people saw, it was the symbolism. For the first time, the mansion realized that it had become a stage for national emotion. Admiration, anger, hope, suspicion, all of it, stirred by a single picture taken in one of its rooms. The estate had longed not to be forgotten, and now it faced the truth of being remembered too vividly. After this moment, the turning point arrived quietly. The mansion accepted that its new identity was no longer something it could control completely. It understood that it had entered a chapter in which the world would define it, argue about it, praise it, and criticize it. But instead of resisting, the estate chose a quieter path. It leaned into its history, its craftsmanship, and its human stories. Staff continued caring for it with the same devotion. Preservationists continued pushing for protection, and visitors continued walking its halls with curiosity, sometimes leaving with interpretations that revealed more about themselves than about the building. The outcome of this 10th event was a new kind of stability, not peaceful, but balanced. The mansion lived in the centre of attention, yet it learned to endure the waves. It remained glamorous, but cautious, active, but watchful. It had become a landmark, not only in architecture, but in the nation's collective imagination. And though this brought challenges, it also ensured that the estate would never fade into obscurity again. And so, as Part 10 comes to its close, the mansion settles beneath the hush of another late night. Staff have finished tidying the rooms. A soft glow remains from a lamp left on for safety near an archway. Outside, a few benches stand empty after a long day of guests passing through. One of those benches, worn smooth by time, holds the faint reflection of indoor light on its curved wooden edge, like a quiet acknowledgement that the mansion has entered a new era, where every shadow, every beam of light, and every story told within its walls matters more than ever before. Tonight, you are listening to Part 11, and this part is about the strange, uneasy shift that took place when the mansion, already watched, judged, and discussed across the country, became the setting for sensitive meetings and private conversations that the nation was never meant to see. This was the period when the estate crossed an invisible line, from being a glamorous social hub into becoming a silent witness to decisions, discussions, and interactions that carried real political weight. And with every whisper exchanged behind its doors, the mansion stepped deeper into a darkness it had never been built to hold. As these gatherings began, the mansion's deepest wish was innocence. It wanted desperately to remain what it had originally been designed to be, a place of beauty, celebration, and escaped worries. It wished that the people who entered its halls would come for art, conversation, or rest, not strategy, tension, or hidden agendas. The estate longed for simplicity in a world that was becoming more complicated with every passing year. But inside its walls an internal conflict brewed. The mansion could feel the tone of the conversations changing. Once, the rooms had held laughter, music, quiet stories about life and travel. Now the voices were lower, more controlled, more serious. Meetings took place behind closed doors. Documents were carried in folders rather than invitations printed on thick paper. Guests walked faster, spoke more carefully, and often remained in private rooms instead of wandering freely through the house. The mansion felt these shifts like tremors beneath its floors, subtle but unsettling. It sensed that it was being used for purposes it had never imagined when it was born from Marjorie's dream almost a century earlier. Outside the gates, opposing forces gathered like distant thunder. Critics questioned whether such meetings should take place in a private club rather than official government spaces. Supporters insisted nothing unusual was happening. Media outlets amplified every rumour. Commentators argued about symbolism. Even those who had never seen the mansion in person felt entitled to describe what they believed happened behind its locked doors. Every headline, every accusation, every defence seemed to pull the estate deeper into the national storm. Yet, in this uneasy period, the mansion discovered unlikely allies. Some staff members, trusted, loyal, and professional, became the quiet guardians of the estate's dignity. They protected privacy, enforced boundaries, and ensured that sensitive moments did not spill into public view. A few guests, respectful and careful, conducted their discussions with awareness of the mansion's history. Preservationists continued reminding the world that the estate, beneath the controversy, was still a rare piece of American architecture worth cherishing. These steady presences offered the mansion a sense of grounding amid the growing tension. The climax of this 11th event came during one particular meeting that would later be spoken about in hushed tones. It happened in a private room overlooking part of the property. An ordinary space turned significant by the people inside it. The details of the discussion would remain a mystery to outsiders, but what mattered was not the topic itself, it was the atmosphere. The air in the room was heavy, the voices measured, the stakes palpable. Staff moving nearby sensed the seriousness without knowing the content, and the mansion, though made of stone and wood, felt the weight of the moment settle into its walls like a shadow. It realised that its identity had irrevocably shifted, not by choice, not by intention, but by the gravity of those who chose to use it as a setting for matters far larger than architecture or society gatherings. A line had been crossed, and the estate understood that it would be remembered for this period in ways it could never control. After that meeting, the turning point unfolded quietly but clearly. The estate accepted that it was now part of a much larger system, political, cultural, and symbolic. It could no longer retreat into the comfort of being a private club. Its rooms would be analysed, its events scrutinised, its role debated. The mansion had become an actor in a story far bigger than itself, and it could not step off the stage. The outcome of this era revealed itself gradually. Security increased, rules tightened, access to certain rooms was limited. Even the staff felt a change in the air, less carefree, more cautious. The estate hosted fewer light-hearted evenings and more strategic gatherings. The public's curiosity grew sharper, their questions heavier. The mansion learned to exist in a strange balance between hospitality and secrecy, between elegance and tension. And yet, through all of this, the estate survived. It stood tall, absorbing each new wave of scrutiny, each new headline, each new whisper. It did not crumble beneath the weight of the moments it had held. Instead, it stored them quietly, as it had stored every other piece of its history. And so, as part 11 comes to a gentle close, the mansion rests in the silence after another private meeting. Lights are dimmed, chairs are neatly arranged again, papers have been carried away. Through a partially closed door, a thin streak of artificial light falls across the floor, straight, controlled, deliberate, and in that narrow beam, the estate senses the truth of this chapter, that even the quietest rooms can hold the world's heaviest moments, and that some shadows do not come from the night, but from the choices made behind closed doors. Tonight, you are listening to part 12, and this part is about the moment when the mansion's quiet involvement in important conversations began to draw the attention of investigators, reporters, and distant authorities, turning its rooms and storage spaces into the centre of questions about what was kept, who had access, and how a place built for beauty had become tangled in the dark weight of secrecy and responsibility. By this time, the estate's deepest wish was for safety and order. It wanted whatever passed through its halls, people, papers, decisions, to be handled with care. It did not want to be the source of scandal or suspicion. It longed for its rooms to be trusted, its security to be sufficient, and its role in larger affairs to remain quiet and dignified, like a guardian holding memories gently without ever misplacing them. Yet inside, an uneasy struggle had taken root. The mansion could feel that some of the items stored within its walls were no longer simple decorations or archived mementos. There were things, boxes, folders, locked cabinets, that carried a different kind of weight, the weight of information. Staff moved around them cautiously. Certain doors were closed more often. Some rooms felt heavier than others, not because of their furniture, but because of the knowledge contained there. The estate, which had once held only music and chatter, now held responsibility it had never asked for. It sensed that if anything went wrong, the blame would not fall only on people, but on the place itself, as if its very existence had allowed trouble to take root. Outside its gates, opposing forces sharpened their focus. Security experts raised concerns in distant interviews about the risks of mixing sensitive matters with a private club environment. Former officials questioned whether any private property, no matter how grand, could provide the right protections. Journalists dug through records looking for patterns, access logs, visiting lists. Legal commentators spoke in calm but firm tones about rules, classifications, and obligations. Each new article, each new rumour, each new statement pressed invisible fingers against the mansion's walls, as though testing for cracks. In the midst of this rising pressure, allies tried to steady the situation. Lawyers worked carefully to interpret rules and obligations. Security teams adjusted protocols, refined access, and strengthened boundaries. Staff who understood both the house and its daily rhythms tried to ensure that rooms were not left open without reason, that documents were handled with respect, that nothing was left unattended where it could cause future harms. Some advisors urged caution, reminding decision-makers that the setting itself, this historic, controversial estate, would magnify any misstep. Their efforts were like quiet hands trying to keep a heavy object from slipping off a narrow ledge. The climax of this 12th event came when questions that had floated in the air for months finally hardened into formal attention. Authorities began taking a closer look at what had been stored in the mansion and how. Reports spread that investigators were interested not only in the people who had passed through, but in the documents and materials that might still rest inside its rooms and storage spaces. The idea of a search, an inspection, or a legal review began to hover over the estate like a storm cloud forming on the horizon. Even before any official step was taken, the knowledge that such action was possible changed the atmosphere. The mansion felt as though its drawers, cabinets, and tucked-away corners had all been silently lit up by a light it could not see, but could deeply feel. The turning point came when it became clear that the house was no longer just a backdrop. It was part of the story itself. Whether or not investigators stepped inside on a given day, the mere expectation that they might do so, or had done so elsewhere, altered how everyone moved. Staff walked more carefully, conversations became more hushed. Objects that once seemed ordinary, boxes, envelopes, locked trunks, suddenly felt charged with significance. The estate understood that, in the eyes of the world, it was now closely tied to questions of law, trust, and evidence. The outcome of this chapter unfolded slowly and heavily. The mansion's name appeared more often in legal analysis. Commentators debated what it meant for a private residence and club to be pulled so directly into formal scrutiny. Supporters argued that the estate was being judged too harshly, that it was only a setting for human choices, not the maker of those choices itself. Critics insisted that the choice of this place as a site for storing sensitive materials revealed something troubling about boundaries and respect for rules. Through it all, the mansion stood, unable to explain that it had never wanted to carry such a burden. Still, it adapted. Security tightened further. Certain rooms became restricted. Storage areas were reorganized. Staff became more aware of what passed through their hands. The estate learned, in a quiet, difficult way, that the cost of being at the centre of important events was not only attention, but accountability. It could not retreat back into being a simple social space. It had become a place where the handling of each object might matter years later. And so, as Part 12 comes to a gentle close, the mansion rests in the deep stillness of late night, its corridors empty, its doors closed, its shelves and cabinets holding their contents in patient silence. Outside, the grounds lie calm beneath a dim sky. Somewhere within the house, in a room that once held nothing more serious than extra linens or unused decorations, a single locked cabinet stands against a wall, its surface plain and unremarkable. No one looks at it in this moment, yet the air around it feels slightly denser, as if the room itself understands that in a world watching closely, even the most ordinary-looking spaces can become the focus of questions that refuse to fade. Tonight you are listening to Enter Part 13, and this part is about the moment when the mansion's uneasy relationship with secrecy, storage, and scrutiny finally collided with the sharp edge of legal investigation. The period when outside authorities, attorneys, agencies, and observers all turned their focus directly onto the estate, examining not only what might be inside its rooms, but what its role meant for boundaries, rules, and national responsibility. This was the chapter when the mansion, built for beauty, suddenly found itself standing in the glare of law and consequence. As this pressure formed, the mansion's deepest wish was for understanding. It wanted those looking into its affairs to see it as a place shaped by people's choices, not a thinking actor. It wished the world would understand that it had never intended to hold sensitive materials or become the stage for legal disputes. The estate longed to be recognised simply as a building caught in the crosswinds of human decisions, a witness, not an instigator. But inside, a sharp internal struggle intensified. The mansion felt the weight of being judged. Its rooms, once admired for their colours and curves, now felt exposed, as if every corner were a potential source of suspicion. Staff moved with tension in their steps, sensing the seriousness of the unfolding situation. Even ordinary objects, a locked drawer, a trunk, a cabinet, felt charged with meaning they were never meant to hold. The estate had been born from dreams of art and society. Now it carried the burden of being part of a legal question far larger than itself. Outside its gates, opposing forces gathered like turbulent currents. Legal experts appeared on television dissecting what might be found inside the mansion. Politicians argued fiercely, some calling for stricter oversight, others defending the estate's privacy. Commentators debated whether it symbolised privilege, carelessness, or simply complexity. Agencies weighed possible action. Journalists studied aerial photographs, wrote speculative articles, and pressed for information. The mansion felt these distant voices as a kind of shaking in its foundation, not physical, but emotional, as if the world's expectations had become too heavy to bear. Yet in this moment of rising scrutiny, allies emerged in careful, quiet ways. Lawyers stepped forward, not to create drama, but to bring order, explaining processes, rights, and obligations. Staff members who had long protected the mansion's dignity worked diligently to ensure compliance, accuracy, and respect for procedure. Advisors urged caution and preparation, reminding all involved that transparency would matter. Even some journalists wrote balanced pieces, acknowledging that the estate was a setting, not a suspect. These voices brought steadiness to a story at risk of being distorted by noise. The climax of this 13th event came on the day when investigators arrived to conduct an official search, a moment that would echo far beyond the mansion's gates. Law enforcement vehicles appeared, Officials stepped out with controlled movements. A sense of formality and seriousness filled the air. Staff watched. With a mixture of worry, resolve, and quiet respect for the process, the mansion felt a profound stillness, as though every stone and beam were holding its breath. Rooms were opened, cabinets inspected, spaces photographed. For hours, the estate became a maze of careful footsteps, questions, notes, and focused examination. Even after the investigators left, the sensation of being looked into lingered, like a shadow pressed into the walls. The turning point arrived not with drama, but with realization. After this day, the mansion would never again be seen as merely a private estate. It would be forever linked to this investigation, to the questions pursued inside its rooms, to the storm of national debate that followed. Its image, once connected only to glamour and controversy, now carried the weight of legal history, and the mansion, silent and immovable, understood that this chapter would shape how future generations spoke about it. The outcome of this period unfolded in long, careful ripples. Legal analysts argued over implications. Supporters defended the estate, saying it had simply been a backdrop to human error. Critics insisted that the mansion represented blurred boundaries between private and official life. Preservationists worried about the estate's future reputation and protection. Residents nearby watched uneasily as crowds of reporters gathered near the gates. Staff inside adjusted to new rules, new caution, new awareness. The estate, now documented and examined, adapted again to survive this new weight placed upon it. And yet, through the heaviness, the mansion found a quiet truth. It had endured. It had not collapsed under scrutiny. It had not shattered under investigation. It remained standing, tired, yes, but strong. Its walls had held through storms before, and they held through this one too. The estate accepted that its story had grown darker, more complex, and more tangled with national discourse than it ever expected. But complexity, it realised, was also a kind of legacy. And so, as Part 13 comes to a gentle close, the mansion lies in the late-night calm that follows difficult days. The investigators are gone. The reporters have stepped back for the evening. Inside, the rooms are restored to order, though the air still feels slightly denser where people walked with purpose earlier. In a quiet corner storage room, a single empty shelf remains where something once rested, its surface smooth, untouched, carrying no secrets, only the faint memory of a moment when the house learned that even the quietest spaces can become the stage for a nation's questions. Tonight, you are listening to Chasbury's Part 14. And this part is about the moment when the aftermath of the legal search sent shockwaves through the mansion, reshaping how the world talked about it and how the estate understood itself. This was the chapter when the house, once only a symbol of glamour or ambition, became a lightning rod for national argument, a place where every opinion, fear, hope, and frustration in the country seemed to collide. It was here that the mansion entered its most turbulent era, one marked by polarization so intense that the estate felt as though its very walls were being pulled in opposite directions. In the beginning of this new storm, the mansion's deepest wish was for calm. It longed to return to a sense of normalcy, events held without tension, rooms filled with voices not sharpened by debate, gates approached without cameras waiting outside. It wished for quiet evenings again, the kind where the only sound was the soft rustle of wind moving through its gardens. After the investigation's wait, all the estate wanted was a chance to breathe. But inside, a powerful internal conflict began to form. The mansion sensed that it no longer belonged to a single narrative. People stepping into its halls brought strong opinions with them, some filled with admiration, others with suspicion. Staff walked carefully, both physically and emotionally, trying to do their jobs while carrying the awareness that every gesture might someday be seen through the lens of national arguments. The mansion, once a place of personal dreams, now felt like a canvas where millions projected their views, hopes, and fears. It struggled with the realization that it could not control how people saw it anymore. Outside, the opposing forces multiplied. News channels ran discussions every night, some speaking of the mansion with urgency and concern, others with defence and justification. Commentators described it as a symbol of larger national divides. Demonstrations, both supportive and critical, took place near its gates. Legal analysts argued back and forth about implications and precedents. Politicians referenced the estate in speeches, using its name to represent entirely different ideas depending on their perspective. Online debates raged endlessly. It felt as though the entire country had decided that the mansion was either a hero, a villain, or something in between, and the estate had no power to explain itself. Yet even in this whirlwind, allies emerged with quiet strength. Preservationists continued defending the mansion's historical significance, reminding the public that architecture and legacy should not be erased by politics. Long-time members and staff spoke about the estate's role as a place of community and continuity. Historians wrote thoughtful pieces highlighting the broader context of the estate's life across a century. These voices did not silence the controversy, but they softened its edges and offered the mansion a sense of grounding during its hardest moments. The climax of this 14th event came when a major public debate erupted across the country, sparked by a televised discussion in which the mansion's role was interpreted in completely opposite ways on the same stage. One side argued that the estate represented privilege and danger. The other side insisted that it symbolised resilience and unfair scrutiny. The mansion became the heart of the argument, not as a place, but as an idea. For hours, millions watched people clash over what the estate meant, what it represented, and what its future should be. And though the discussion happened far beyond its walls, the mansion felt the intensity echo inside its rooms, vibrating like a storm thundering from a distance. The turning point came afterward, as the mansion realised something profound. It had entered a realm where meaning would always be decided by others. It was no longer simply seen, it was interpreted. It understood that, for many people, it had become more than a building. It had become a symbol woven into the fabric of national narratives, and symbols, once created, cannot choose the stories told about them. The outcome of this chapter unfolded across months. Journalists continued covering the estate, but with more nuance as time passed. Public attention rose and fell like tides. Lawsuits, hearings, debates, and arguments left their marks, but eventually softened as newer stories emerged in the nation's consciousness. The mansion learned to endure the noise, to let waves of public opinion crash and recede without losing itself entirely. And through it all, life within the estate continued. Staff opened windows in the mornings, letting sunlight fall across the floors. Gardeners trimmed hedges with steady hands. Quiet events were held in restored rooms. The mansion discovered that normalcy, even when surrounded by chaos, could still find small ways to bloom. And so, as part 14 comes to a gentle close, the mansion rests under a muted sky after a long day of calm following months of turmoil. A row of chairs sits neatly stacked in an empty event hall. Near a tall window, a thin curtain moves slightly from a breeze slipping through a small gap. The faint movement looks like a slow, thoughtful breath, a reminder that even places swept or into the centre of a national storm can find moments of stillness, holding onto themselves while the world continues to argue just beyond their gates. Tonight you are listening to Part 15, And this part is about the moment when the mansion stepped deeper into the world of hidden influence, the era when powerful figures, wealthy visitors, and ambitious networkers began using the estate not simply as a gathering space, but as a subtle arena of negotiation, persuasion, and private strategy. It was during these years that the mansion shifted from being a symbolic centerpiece of national debate into becoming a quiet crossroads of power, where unspoken intentions floated through polished rooms, and every handshake carried echoes far beyond the estate's walls. At the beginning of this new chapter, the mansion's deepest wish was clarity and fairness. It wanted the people walking through its doors to engage with honesty, to speak plainly, to recognize the house as a place of hospitality rather than a tool for personal agendas. The estate longed for conversations that were genuine, balanced, and grounded, the kind of exchanges that once filled its halls in gentler decades. Yet, as influential visitors continued to arrive, the mansion sensed that the meaning of these gatherings had changed. No longer were these rooms simply backdrops to pleasant dinners or cultural events. Discussions now carried weight, tension, purpose. In quiet lounges, voices lowered as decisions were considered. In private corners, alliances took shape. The estate could feel this shift like a cool draft moving beneath a closed door, subtle but unmistakable. Inside, a heavy internal conflict grew. The mansion remembered what it had been, a creation of beauty, a home for art and elegance, a social retreat for refined gatherings. But now, its rooms hosted a different kind of energy, one built from ambition instead of admiration. People walked with intent, scanned with calculation, spoke with layers. Staff sensed the shift too, moving carefully around guests who operated with sharper awareness and expectations. The estate longed to return to its softer identity, but history had pulled it into a new role it could not escape. Outside the mansion, opposing forces sharpened their perspectives. Critics argued that the estate had become a symbol of hidden deals, a place where boundaries between personal and political blurred. Supporters insisted that no wrongdoing existed, that the mansion was simply a venue naturally chosen by powerful individuals for convenience and comfort. Media outlets treated the estate as a magnet for speculation, analysing who entered and who left, how long they stayed, what might have been discussed. Each storyline added another layer to the estate's public identity, often divorced from the reality inside its walls. And yet even in this period of tension, the mansion discovered allies, steady, grounded, and often invisible. Staff members maintained professionalism, ensuring that events ran smoothly and respectfully. A few thoughtful guests carried themselves with sincerity, using the estate as a place for meaningful conversation instead of opportunistic manoeuvring. Preservationists continued advocating for the mansion's cultural value, reminding the public that its architectural legacy deserved respect no matter the storm swirling around it. These voices provided small islands of relief in a sea of competing narratives. The climax of this 15th event came during an evening gathering that, on the surface, appeared ordinary. Tables were set, lights glowed warmly, guests entered in elegant attire. But as the night progressed, the estate sensed a palpable shift. In one room, several influential individuals held an intense, quiet discussion. Their postures were rigid, their voices measured, their faces thoughtful but tense. Staff passing by could feel something heavy in the air, the kind of conversation where decisions, even if informal, might ripple far beyond the moment. The mansion, though silent and unchanging, felt the gravity settle into its structure. It understood that the house had become more than a stage. It had become a vessel for influence. The turning point came in the hours after the guests departed. As staff cleared tables and polished surfaces, the mansion recognized a truth it could no longer ignore. Its identity would be shaped not only by the events held within it, but by the intentions carried into it. The estate could not choose who came through its doors or why. It could only hold the echoes of their words and carry the weight of what unfolded. And in this realization, the mansion felt both older and wiser, as if it had aged decades in a single night. The outcome of this chapter settled in gradually. Public fascination grew sharper. Analysts speculated about the estate's role in power dynamics. Books and essays referenced the mansion as a place where influence flowed behind closed doors. Critics pointed to the estate as a symbol of informal networks. Supporters argued for privacy and discretion. Through all of this, the mansion stood, absorbing each perspective, without the ability to respond or defend itself. Yet inside, life continued. Staff opened windows each morning, letting in sea air. Guests arrived for ordinary visits. Sunlight coloured the floors. Gardens were trimmed and furniture polished. The estate learned to exist in duality, a peaceful home to daily routines and a powerful symbol in the public eye. And so as part 15 comes to a soft close, the mansion rests under the quietness of a late hour. A hallway that saw whispered conversations earlier now sits in stillness, with only a faint reflection of a distant lamp stretching across the polished floor. Along a wall, a framed piece of art hangs undisturbed, catching a sliver of light, a gentle reminder that beneath the shifting tides of influence and intention, the mansion's original spirit remains, holding onto its quieter truths, even as the world assigns it far larger shadows. Tonight you are listening to your part 16, and this part is about the moment when the mansion's reputation, already tangled in power, debate, secrecy, and influence, began to transform into something larger than itself, a cultural symbol carried by the entire nation, a place people spoke about, not because they had seen it, but because they believed they understood what it meant. This was the era when the mansion discovered that a building can become a myth, and that myths often carry shadows far heavier than stone or wood. At the start of this new chapter, the mansion's deepest wish was for honesty. It wanted the world to see it clearly, not as a caricature or battleground of symbolic arguments, but as a real place, with real walls, real staff, and a real history shaped by decades of human decisions. It wished that people who had never stepped inside would speak of it with fairness rather than certainty. It wanted to remain a home, a club, a piece of architecture, not a lightning bolt in cultural storms. But inside its halls, an internal conflict began to burn quietly. The estate sensed that the conversations happening around it now had almost nothing to do with its floors, its rooms, its gardens, or its history. Instead, people talked about what the mansion represented: wealth, privilege, power, secrecy, influence, division, legacy, and the future of the country. The estate, which had once fought so hard not to be forgotten, now found itself struggling under the weight of being remembered too intensely. Its identity was being stretched into shapes it had never chosen. Outside its walls, the opposing forces multiplied with astonishing speed. Documentaries were produced about the estate and its role in shaping national conversations. Commentators used the mansion's name as shorthand for political divides. Activists held signs referencing it. Supporters described it as a symbol of resilience and strength. Critics framed it as the embodiment of inequality and controversy. News headlines mentioned the estate even when the events being discussed did not happen inside it. Its name became a metaphor, a reference point, a cultural shorthand. And the mansion, silent, unmoving, unable to speak for itself, felt the storm swirl around it like a great whirlpool of meaning. Yet even in this overwhelming tide of interpretations, unexpected allies offered balance. Historians wrote calmly about its architectural heritage. Cultural scholars analysed its shifting symbolism with nuance instead of accusation. Preservation groups argued that no matter what happened in modern politics, the mansion remained an irreplaceable piece of American history. Visitors who came in person often left with gentler impressions, describing the estate as beautiful, peaceful, or surprisingly human. Staff continued caring for it with pride, reminding themselves and others that the mansion was not merely an idea. It was a living place shaped by countless hands. Their steady work kept the building anchored when the world tried to turn it into something abstract. The climax of this 16th event emerged unexpectedly, not from a single incident, but from a flood of cultural references that swept across the country. One month, the mansion was featured in several major news cycles: a political speech, a comedy show, a satirical cartoon, and a college debate. All unrelated, all using the estate as a symbol to make a point. People who had never been within 1,000 miles of the property argued confidently about what it truly represented. The mansion, if it could feel emotion, might have felt overwhelmed. It had become an icon, a charged image, floating far above reality, used by millions of people for millions of reasons. The house itself could never influence or correct. The turning point came when the estate finally understood something profound. Its cultural identity was no longer its own. It belonged to the nation's imagination. People would continue to project onto it whatever fears, hopes, judgments, or beliefs they carried. This realization brought both sorrow and clarity. Sorrow because the estate wanted to be understood for what it actually was. Clarity because it finally recognized that it had no power over the stories people chose to tell about it. In accepting this truth, the mansion found a strange kind of peace. The outcome of this period unfolded in a mix of intensity and calm. Debates continued, but they no longer felt new. Discussions rose and fell like waves, some sharp, some shallow, all eventually fading into the wider ocean of national discourse. The estate began learning to live with its symbolic identity the way a mountain lives with the storms that strike it, by enduring rather than resisting. Inside, daily life continued with quiet dignity. Staff polished the floors, served meals, trimmed the hedges, greeted guests. Small events were held without fanfare. Private conversations echoed gently in side rooms. Sunlight moved across rugs and paintings, just as it always had. The mansion realised that while the outside world argued about meaning, the inside world offered continuity, and in that continuity it found strength. And so as Part 16 comes to a soft close, the mansion rests under a calm night sky after a day filled with nothing extraordinary, just routine tasks, familiar footsteps, and the quiet hum of evening air drifting through open windows. On a small table near an interior courtyard, a single glass of water sits untouched, left behind by someone who stepped out only for a moment. The moonlight catches the surface of the water, creating a faint trembling glow, as if reflecting not the storms of public opinion, but the house's own steady heartbeat, a reminder that even when the world transforms a place into a symbol, the truth of the place remains quietly, beautifully real. Tonight you are listening to Part 17, and this part is about the moment when the mansion, already burdened with symbolism and debate, became the subject of deep scholarly disagreement, a chapter where historians, legal experts, cultural theorists, and political analysts argued fiercely over its meaning, its role, and even its rightful place in America's narrative. This was the era when the estate learned that being part of history meant being questioned, reinterpreted, and reframed again and again, often in ways that pulled its identity in opposite directions. As this chapter began, the mansion's deepest wish was simple. It wanted truth. Not praise, not defense, not criticism, just truth. It wanted people to understand its story with nuance, to see not only its controversies, but also its origins, its architecture, the hands that built it, the decades it survived, and the quiet human moments that shaped its long life. It longed for a fair telling, one not overshadowed by modern tensions. But inside its own halls, an internal conflict tightened. The estate felt torn between its many identities: a historic residence, a private club, a political symbol, a cultural argument. It remembered the elegant parties of the 1920s, the years of neglect, the revival, the conflicts, the investigations, the endless interpretations. Each layer of meaning felt like a different face placed upon the same old walls. The mansion did not know which face was truly its own. It feared being misunderstood forever. Outside its gates, the opposing forces sharpened like blades. Historians disagreed on its significance. Some argued it was an important example of American Gilded Age architecture, while others said it represented excess without deeper cultural value. Political analysts debated its role in modern events. Legal scholars discussed boundaries, ethics, and implications. Cultural theorists framed it as a reflection of America's divide, luxury and controversy intertwined. Journalists contributed more interpretations, shaping public imagination even further. Every expert seemed to pull the mansion in a different direction. And yet among this storm of opinions, allies emerged with measured voices. A small group of historians wrote careful, balanced studies about the estate's architectural heritage. Archivists preserved letters, photographs, and construction documents to ensure future generations could understand the mansion's origins. Former staff members shared memories of kindness, routine, and humanity inside the estate, reminding people that the mansion was more than the headlines. Even visitors who came with open minds often left with softened views after experiencing the estate's quiet beauty firsthand. These voices became something like anchors, steadying the mansion through the swirl of conflicting interpretations. The climax of this 17th event unfolded when 5 major scholarly debates ignited at once, each addressing a different aspect of the mansion's existence. One debate centered on architecture. Was the estate a masterpiece or simply extravagant? Another explored its political symbolism. Was it a legitimate meeting place or an inappropriate one? A third examined its cultural impact. Did it unite or divide? A fourth questioned its legal implications. What boundaries had been blurred? And a fifth debate asked perhaps the hardest question of all. Should the mansion be remembered for what happened inside it, or for what people believed happened inside it? These debates played out in articles, conferences, televised panels, and university halls. And though the estate could not hear words directly, it felt the tension reverberate through the way visitors walked, staff spoke, and journalists observed. The turning point came when the mansion realised something profound. These debates were not about discovering the correct meaning of the estate, they were reflections of the nation's own internal struggles. People were not arguing about the building itself. They were arguing about what the building allowed them to express, their concerns, fears, values, and hopes for the country. This realization eased the mansion's internal conflict. It understood that being debated meant it mattered. Being questioned meant it was alive in the nation's consciousness. And being interpreted in many ways meant it had become more than stone. It had become a mirror. The outcome of this chapter unfolded gradually. The scholarly debates did not end, but they softened into long-term discussions rather than heated battles. Books were published with more nuance. Documentaries approached the estate with greater care. Visitors began arriving not only with curiosity, but with awareness, eager to understand the estate's layered past rather than judge it. The mansion discovered that being the subject of debate was not a burden, but a sign of relevance. It had become part of America's intellectual landscape. And so, as Part 17 comes to a gentle close, The mansion sits beneath the quiet sky of another evening. Inside a library room, rarely visited during busy events, a handful of old books rest neatly on a wooden table. The room is dim, lit only by a small lamp near the corner. A single page from an open book curls slightly from a soft draft moving through a vent. That delicate motion seems to echo the estate's truth, that meanings shift, interpretations change, and even the quietest places can become the centre of great discussions. Tonight you are listening to part 18, and this part is about the season when misunderstandings about the mansion grew larger than the mansion itself, when stories that were half true or not true at all spread faster than careful facts, wrapping the estate in a fog of rumour that made it hard for anyone on the outside to see what really lived within its walls. By the time this chapter began, the house had already become a symbol, a debate, even a case study, and its deepest wish now was very quiet. It simply wanted to be seen as it was. It wanted people to remember that behind every headline and every argument there was still a building made of stone and tile and wood, with a long history before the latest news cycle and a daily life that did not fit into short, sharp sentences. It wished that those who spoke about it would do so with patience, with curiosity, and with a willingness to admit that they did not know everything that had ever happened inside its rooms. Yet inside, an internal struggle grew heavier. The mansion understood that most of the people talking about it would never walk its hallways, never feel the slight temperature change between an older wing and a newer one, never see the small chips in the floor that came from chairs being moved over decades. It felt trapped in two worlds: the real one, where staff arranged tables, checked locks and watered plants, and the imagined one where strangers far away confidently described secret tunnels, forbidden rooms, and dramatic confrontations that had never taken place. The estate did not know how to live with these two versions of itself, and this confusion settled deep into its bones like a weight that could not be put down. Outside, the opposing forces of misunderstanding gathered in many forms. Fast comments travelled across screens, repeating the same bold phrases without context. Some people claimed the mansion had always been a political fortress, forgetting the decades when it hosted quieter phases of social life. Others said that everything inside it was suspicious, as if no ordinary conversation had ever taken place there. There were stories about hidden chambers that in reality were nothing more than storage spaces. Stories about constant secret meetings on evenings when the building had actually been almost empty. Stories about strange signals and codes that were really just ordinary lights and maintenance routines. Tour buses sometimes advertised the estate with dramatic language, promising visitors that they would see the heart of controversy, even when the tour itself could only show them certain hallways and distant views. Rumour began to behave like paint spilled on a floor, spreading thinner and wider than anyone expected. In the middle of this, allies tried to lift pieces of the truth back into view. A local guide who knew the mansion well refused to exaggerate during tours, choosing instead to explain both its beautiful and difficult chapters in calm, measured words. A history teacher used the estate as an example in class, showing students how easily a place could be turned into a symbol and how important it was to check sources before believing what they heard. A writer visited and later published a thoughtful piece that included not only controversy but also details about the craftsmanship, the long ago workers, and the years of neglect that almost ended the mansion's story. Some older residents of the community told their grandchildren about attending small events there decades earlier, describing simple things like the taste of the food, the sound of chairs being moved, and the feeling of walking up the drive in nicer clothes than they usually wore. These gentle voices did not erase confusion, but they created small pockets of clarity. The climax of this 18th event arrived on a day when a particularly dramatic rumour caught fire. A story spread online, claiming that a locked door within the estate hid a forbidden chamber where terrible secrets had been kept. In reality, the door led to a modest storage room that held extra linens, unused chairs, and cleaning supplies. The rumour grew anyway, shared and reshared, until people spoke of it as if it were confirmed fact. Some visitors arrived with bright, hungry curiosity in their eyes, asking staff about the hidden room, as if it were a legendary cave. The mansion felt a strange ache at this, an almost human sadness that people were more interested in a made-up shadow than in the real, complicated life it had actually lived. One afternoon, a small group of guests on a guided tour asked the careful guide about the rumour directly. The guide paused, then chose the harder path. Instead of laughing it off, or feeding the legend, she led them to the plain door, explained what was on the other side, and used the moment to talk about how stories grow when people prefer excitement over accuracy. The group listened more quietly than before. One person even said they felt slightly embarrassed for having believed the rumour without question. That simple exchange became the turning point. It showed the mansion that while it could not stop misunderstandings from being born, it could still be part of gentle corrections when people were willing to see with their own eyes. In the months that followed, the outcome of this chapter spread slowly. Some rumours faded when newer ones appeared elsewhere. Some myths settled into the background as half-remembered exaggerations. A few people, who had once spoken loudly about things they did not understand, grew more cautious. Others remained attached to their favourite stories, unwilling to let go. The mansion realised that misunderstanding was not an enemy that could be defeated once and for all. It was more like a tide that rose and fell, sometimes higher, sometimes lower, but always present at the edges of truth. Inside, however, the house found a quiet way to live with this reality. It focused on what it could control, being well kept, being safe, being a space where those who actually entered could experience something real. Staff continued to tell accurate stories. Guides continued to answer questions honestly. Daily tasks continued with patient regularity. The estate accepted that there would always be two versions of it in the world, the one made of walls and air and memory, and the one made of words and assumptions. It chose to root itself in the first, even while acknowledging the second. And so as part 18 comes to a soft close, the mansion stands at the end of another day. The last visitors have gone. A service cart waits in a quiet corridor, half emptied, with a folded cloth resting on its top shelf. Near one of the side entrances, a simple door with a metal handle stands closed, looking exactly as ordinary as it truly is. A stripe of late sunlight falls across the floor in front of it, thin and steady, like a quiet line drawn between what people imagine and what actually exists, inviting anyone who cares enough to step closer and look for themselves. Tonight you are listening to part 19, and this part is about the moment when the mansion, after nearly a century of shifting identities, storms of attention, and waves of misunderstanding, faced the uncertain question of its own future. This was the era when architects, planners, critics, loyal members, worried residents, and even distant observers wondered what would become of the estate as it aged. Would it be preserved, transformed, divided, modernised, or quietly altered until almost none of its original spirit remained? It was a moment when the mansion itself seemed to stand on a delicate threshold, aware that every decision made about it now would echo far beyond the present. At the beginning of this chapter, the mansion's deepest wish was continuity. After surviving abandonment, revival, scrutiny, investigation, and myth-making, the estate longed to remain whole. It wanted its halls, gardens, and courtyards to keep breathing together as one story, one structure, one legacy. The house wished that the work of the builders who shaped it in the 1920s would not be undone by rushed renovations or careless modernisation. It hoped that those who cared for it would safeguard its original spirit rather than reshape it beyond recognition. But inside its walls, an internal conflict grew sharper than in earlier years. The estate knew that time changes everything. Paint peels, tiles crack, old wiring strains under modern demands. Heavy storms test foundations. Staff work tirelessly to maintain the illusion of eternal strength. Yet the mansion feels every vibration, every shift in temperature, every small structural sigh. Part of the house feared decay, another part feared change even more. It did not know which future to prefer: gentle aging with integrity, or aggressive restoration that risked erasing its soul. Outside its gates, opposing forces gathered around the question of what the mansion should become. Preservationists insisted that every detail, from the carved ceilings to the patterned floors, should remain untouched, arguing that the estate was a historical artefact deserving strict protection. Developers proposed expansions or additions, imagining new wings, updated facilities, or altered layouts that would better suit modern use. Community members voiced concerns about increased activity, traffic, noise, and the strain of constant events. Environmental advocates questioned the sustainability of maintaining such a large property near the coast as weather patterns grew more unpredictable. Legal advisors reviewed long-term liabilities. Financial planners calculated costs of upkeep. Every group believed their perspective was the correct one, and their disagreements created an invisible tug of war around the estate's future. Yet, even in this uncertainty, allies stepped forward with steady vision. Skilled craftsmen advocated for careful restoration techniques that would respect the building's origins. Architects who loved its Mediterranean revival style recommended subtle updates that would strengthen the structure without compromising its character. Some long-time members expressed a desire to preserve the estate for future generations to enjoy. Staff who had worked within the mansion for decades knew which parts needed care, which parts needed reinforcement, and which corners carried memories too fragile to be disturbed. Their voices formed a quiet but determined network of support. The climax of this 19th event arrived when a major restoration proposal was brought forward, one that, if approved, would significantly impact the building's layout, infrastructure, and long-term preservation. The plan included modern safety upgrades, structural repairs, and necessary improvements to aging systems. But it also suggested changes that would alter the mansion's flow, repurpose certain rooms, and remove features that some considered outdated. The debate that followed was intense. Preservationists argued that too much change would erase history. Planners insisted that without updates, the mansion could not endure the coming decades. Community members worried about increased capacity and expanded events. Financial experts warned of rising costs. Supporters of modernisation emphasised practicality. Meanwhile, critics claimed the estate should remain untouched as a historical symbol. The mansion felt the pressure like a weight pressing on its very foundation. It wished it could speak, point to the rooms that needed reinforcement, the places where water seeped in during storms, the areas where careful updates would ensure its survival. But it also wished to protect the artistry carved into its bones, the original vision that had inspired its creation. It felt trapped between preservation and adaptation. The turning point came in an unexpected moment during a quiet walkthrough with a small group of experts. One architect paused in a long hallway where sunlight filtered softly across old tiles and said that the essence of the estate was not in any single feature, but in the harmony of the whole. A preservationist agreed, noting that thoughtful adaptation could honour the mansion's history while ensuring its future. A staff member added that the estate must continue living, not as a frozen relic, but as a place still capable of hosting real people and real experiences. In that moment of unlikely agreement, something settled. a path forward that balanced memory with necessity. The outcome of this chapter began taking shape in the decisions that followed. Plans were approved for careful restoration rather than sweeping renovation. Fragile areas would be strengthened without altering their appearance. Outdated systems would be modernised discreetly. Rooms used for daily operations would be upgraded without disturbing historical elements. Gardens would be re-landscaped using original plant designs where possible. The estate would remain whole, updated, but still itself. This compromise allowed the mansion to breathe again. It learned that its future did not have to be a choice between untouched preservation and overwhelming change. It could evolve carefully, learning from its past while preparing for its next century. And so, as Part 19 comes to a soft close, the mansion stands in the hush of evening. Workers have finished for the day, leaving their tools neatly arranged in a corner. A ladder rests quietly beneath a section of ceiling, awaiting gentle restoration. Near a window, a thin line of dust from recent repair work catches the last traces of golden light. The air is calm, carrying the scent of fresh varnish and old wood mingling together, as if the past and future are shaking hands in silence, agreeing to continue forward, side by side. Tonight you are listening to Huaf, Part 20. And this final part is about the mansion's long journey, a century of ambition, loneliness, revival, conflict, misunderstanding, influence, debate, and transformation, and the quiet way it finally learned to live with the weight of everything it had witnessed. This is the chapter where the estate, now older, wiser, and calmer, stands not as a battlefield of symbols or a vessel of controversy, but as a place that simply is, holding its history with dignity and offering its silence to anyone who wishes to understand it, without noise. As this last chapter begins, the mansion's deepest wish is peace. Not the fragile peace that comes from being ignored, and not the noisy peace of forced agreement, but the deep, steady peace of a place that knows its story has been told in full. The estate longs to rest gently in its own truth, neither exaggerated nor diminished, neither glorified nor condemned. It wishes for a future where visitors walk its halls with calm curiosity, where its gardens grow without tension, and where its legacy is neither feared nor worshipped, simply understood. But even in this soft wish, an internal struggle remains. The mansion has lived through many identities: dream, palace, burden, relic, revival, club, symbol, controversy, myth, and mirror. Part of it wonders which identity will survive into the future. Another part wonders whether that question even matters anymore. It feels both the weight of the past and the lightness of having endured it. It knows that stories about it will continue to shift long after the current generation is gone. It knows that its walls will keep holding echoes. It knows that time will keep carving its mark. The struggle now is not fear, it is acceptance. Outside its gates, the opposing forces have grown quieter. Fewer headlines erupt with urgency. Fewer debates rise like storms. Scholars have published their studies. Critics have made their points. Supporters have shared their pride. Tourists visit, not with blazing opinions, but with simple curiosity. Local residents walk nearby with familiarity rather than suspicion. Even political commentators, once fierce in their interpretations, now mention the mansion only when relevant, no longer treating it as a constant emblem of conflict. The estate watches this softening with relief, and still, allies continue to protect it. Preservationists oversee its slow, careful restoration. Craftsmen repair its aging details with respect. Gardeners tend its paths so sunlight can move gently across trimmed leaves. Staff prepare rooms each day with the same calm dedication that sustained the mansion through storms, scrutiny, and silence. Visitors speak more softly within its halls, sensing that they are inside a place that has carried a century of human emotion. These quiet allies, steady and consistent, form the final ring of guardians around the estate's legacy. The climax of this 20th event is not a single dramatic moment, but a realization, one that settles into the mansion like a warm, late afternoon light. It is the understanding that the estate's true story cannot be captured by any one version of events. It is not defined by a single era, a single owner, a single controversy, or a single interpretation. Its story is the collection of everything: the dreamer who built it, the workers who shaped it, the decades of emptiness, the revival, the conflict, the whispers, the debates, the hopes, the shadows, the misunderstandings, the gatherings, the quiet mornings, the storms that rattled windows, the investigators who walked through its rooms, the myths projected onto it, the caretakers who protected it, and the visitors who stood in awe beneath its ceilings. The turning point in this final chapter arrives gently. The estate accepts its identity as a living paradox. It is both beautiful and burdened, admired and criticised, loved and questioned. It is a place where joy and controversy have shared the same air. It is a home shaped by hands long gone and watched by eyes not yet born. And in accepting that paradox, the mansion becomes free. It no longer tries to prove anything, it simply stands. The outcome of this last chapter is a kind of quiet triumph. The mansion endures. It breathes through decades of change. It stands through cycles of judgment. It learns, adapts, survives, and continues. It becomes a piece of American memory, not because of perfection, but because of persistence. Its legacy is not a single story, but the fact that it holds so many stories, each one adding a layer of meaning to the next. And so as part 20, the final part, comes to a close, the mansion rests in the soft quiet of night. Most of the lights are off. A gentle breeze moves through a courtyard where shadows pool beside old stone. In one of the smaller rooms, restored with care, a chair is turned slightly toward a window overlooking the water. The moon reflects on the surface outside, trembling faintly with the tide. The room is empty, yet it feels full of every voice that once passed through, every silence that once settled, every dream, every worry, every moment of the past 100 years. And in that stillness, with the moonlight touching its walls, the mansion feels something close to peace, a quiet, enduring truth that its story will continue to live, not in arguments or headlines, but in the gentle way people will remember the echoes of a house that stood through everything time placed before it.